June, right? June hungry for history programming. I'm really excited about today's program because it's sort of the beginning of us celebrating World War I Centennial. So 1917 was the U.S.'s entry into World War I, and of course 1918 was the end of hostilities with the signing of the armistice in November of 1918. So we're in the middle of a 2-year, basically, centennial of U.S.'s involvement in World War I. With that, the city has decided to try to honor Savannahans' involvement and Georgia's involvement in World War I. We are trying to do a lecture series, and Brittany Sealey with Georgia Southern University has agreed to help us kick that off today with our first lecture. Before she gets started and I turn it over to her, I want to mention our next lecture, which is going to be on Friday, July 28th. Lisa Vaughn, who was also with Georgia Southern, is going to talk to us on the topic of German internment camps in Georgia. It's going to be the German Hun in the Georgia Sun, enemy aliens in World War I, Georgia. There's a flyer on the table there that if you're interested, pick that up, and you can sign up for that on Friday, July 28th, same place here at 12 noon on that day. Also, I want you to sort of plant a bug in your ear. We are starting to plan an exhibit for the entire year of 2018 here at City Hall that is going to focus on Savannahans' role in World War I, both here at the home front and on the battlefields in Europe. So how did we contribute to the war effort? So we're hoping that Savannahans will sort of look in their collections at home. What do they have in terms of artifacts, photographs, documents that they can share through loans, or if they have two-dimensional materials that we just digitize and scan and then return to them. So if you have things or know people who have things that they would share with us, help us spread the word. So that's also on the flyer there on the corner of the table. So we're actively seeking participation to make this a real community exhibit. Also want to mention to you another exhibit that we just installed in the council chamber across the hall called Small Treasures. And that was a partnership with cultural institutions in Savannah that shared with us different small treasures from their collection that cover all sorts of different types of interesting Savannah history. There is one World War I item in there from the USS Savannah submarine tender. And if any of you are interested in getting a sneak peek at that, because we have not publicly announced that exhibit yet, after this program, we will take you over and see that Small Treasures exhibit. So I think that will be really exciting. The official opening of that won't be until Friday, July 7th. So let me introduce our speaker, Brittany Sealey. Oops, that's my wrong speaker. So Brittany graduated from Georgia Southern University's Master of Arts in History and also received a certificate in Public History. As a graduate student, she curated Georgia Southern University Museum's exhibit, The World's War is Georgia's War, 1917 to 1919. The exhibit focuses on the state of Georgia's unique World War I story. Brittany has also participated in projects on Irish migration to Savannah, Mexican-American soldiers' experiences during World War II, and the divergent racial experiences of Mexican-Americans in California and Mississippi. Her current research analyzes the criminalization and racialization of Germans in Georgia to justify their internment during World War I. And if you missed it, last year Brittany came and presented on her research on the Wexford-Savannah migration, so Irish immigrants that migrated from County Wexford to Savannah during the middle of the 19th century. She did a wonderful presentation, and it is available on our website. So if you missed that, you really need to check out Brittany's presentation for us on the Wexford migration. So Brittany?
Good afternoon, officially. So as Luciana said, I've spent the last year working with the Georgia Southern Museum to curate this exhibit. And if you haven't been out to the museum already, you should definitely go. But I know that hour-long drive is sometimes a discouragement from doing that. And so you're going to kind of get the VIP tour of what you would get if you came to the exhibit. You should still go though, because there's more pictures, there's more artifacts, and it's cool, and I spent a lot of work on it. There's also a full-scale replica trench in there, so if you have kids, bring them. They really like climbing in it and putting on the gas mask and the helmet. That's really sanitary, you know, to do that.
And they get free admission.
Yes.
Over there.
Yes, so if you pick up a flyer, you get free admission. Bring that flyer and you'll get a free pass into the exhibit. There's also other exhibits that you'll be able to see when you come into the museum, but of course the World War I exhibit's the best, obviously. So today I'm just going to talk about basically what if you were in the exhibit, the tour I would give. And if you have any questions, save them up and ask at the end. I'll answer anything. You're free to interrogate me. So the photo I always like starting with is this picture of Ike Simmons. And he's 87 years old when this photo was taken, and he's from Atlanta, Georgia, and he's holding 2 service flags. Each one of those stars represents a family member in the service. In this case, Ike Simmons had 11 sons serving in the First World War. And the reason why I like to start with this photo is because it shows right off the bat how huge of an impact this war was going to have on Georgians. Even though Americans were only in the war for 2 years, imagine the impact this war is going to have on just this one family who has 11 sons in service. And it's not just going to affect soldiers themselves, it's going to have social implications, it's going to have economic implications for the state. I also always have to show this photo because it just seems too Georgian to not show. So these are German prisoners interned at Fort McPherson near Atlanta, and they are eating watermelon in front of a Coca-Cola sign. So Coca-Cola, there's your advertisement. I feel like I should get paid from Coca-Cola, but. All right, so just a little overview of how the war began and how it became a worldwide conflict. This was something that started as a relatively local issue with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But because of the system of alliances in place, but also colonization at the time, this is going to have a worldwide impact and encompass several countries around the globe. So for example, when the United Kingdom enters, you're going to have Scotland troops, you're going to have Canadian troops, Indian troops, Australian troops, people from New Zealand, all because of colonization and alliances. And so that's how everyone gets entangled in war. So the war starts in 1914. The United States doesn't join until 3 years later, 1917. So what were Americans thinking about at the time? Were they discussing it? Were they even caring about this war in Europe? And the answer is yes. Newspapers, including in Georgia, did talk about the war, and Americans were actively debating whether or not, 1, they should intervene in the war, and 2, if they did get involved, what was that going to mean? What was that intervention going to look like? But for many people in Georgia, they were more concerned with another conflict, and that was border tensions with Mexico. At the time, the Mexican Revolution had been going on in Mexico, and Pancho Villa had crossed over into U.S. territory. That, with some other disputes with sailors in Mexico, caused the U.S. government to station American troops, including Georgia National Guardsmen, on the border with Mexico. And so when you look at Georgia newspapers, you'll see columns on World War I, but they're after headlines about conflict and potential war with Mexico. And so this was much closer to Georgians' hearts, 1, because they had their own National Guardsmen deployed to the Mexican border, but also this is closer than a conflict going on all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. The other thing with this was that initially many Georgians were actually more angry at the British than they were Germans. And that was because when the war had broken out, the British established a naval blockade to cut off trade. And so that was, Georgians felt, violating U.S. neutrality just as much as unrestricted submarine warfare by Germans. They thought that was going to harm their trade, harm them economically, and they thought entering the war would just cause more damage to Georgia economically. And then this is a picture of Georgia soldiers serving on the Mexican border in 1916. So these are, and I apologize for the blurriness of some of the artifact photos, but these are some of the artifacts we have in the exhibit, and I want to point out this small service medal right here. So that service medal was made by the mayor of Macon, Georgia, for those who served on the Mexican border, and this one is for a soldier who served in 1916 on the Mexican border. This medal in the center is also interesting, and a theme that I'm going to point out throughout the presentation is the connection between the Civil War and the First World War. So when the First World War breaks out, you still have Civil War veterans alive, and they were very, very supportive of soldiers going and fighting in the First World War. And what this medal in the center is basically for a soldier who fought in the First World War and was a descendant of a Confederate veteran. And so we have a couple of artifacts that are going to display that connection. These we'll come back to, but these are candlestick holders that are in the Spirit of the American Doughboy sculpture layout. So although Georgians were hesitant to join the war for the first 3 years, when the U.S. does declare war on Germany on April 6, 1917, they get on board. And they did that for a couple of reasons. First of all, they wanted to kind of clear their name after the notorious 1915 lynching of Leo Frank, which I'll get back to later. But they also didn't want to be viewed as unloyal or unpatriotic. And that was actually almost a crime at this time. Legal legislation was passed that basically made it illegal to speak out against the war. And so Georgians didn't want to be viewed as backwards and against the war effort. And I love this photo because it's Georgia soldiers, you have your Red Cross nurses, and then they say, "To hell with the Kaiser," on the side of the train. So the Kaiser being the king of Germany at the time. One of Georgia's most noteworthy or well-known contributions to the First World War is having the most training bases of any other state in the country. So quite literally, Georgia trained the nation's soldiers, and that would be for a variety of units. So you'd have infantry units, artillery units, supply and transportation, and then you also have some new kind of special units that you never would have had before. So for example, the machine gun training unit. This is going to be the first time you really see machine guns in war, and so you have a machine gun training unit in Georgia. And these are actually people, each one of these little dots, these are people laying out in a machine gun formation. And I feel so sorry for the poor souls that had to stand out in this field, I'm guessing in the middle of summer, because that's what the Army would do, to get this picture perfectly right. And these are the buildings in the back, so you can see how many people this is. I mean, it's cool, but I mean, your tax dollars at work. You also had Allied forces from around the world coming to Georgia to train. And so this is a photo, a panoramic, of Allied surgeons meeting at Camp Greenleaf for training. So you have not just Americans training in Georgia, but people from around the world. These are some more of our artifacts. So talking about locals coming and donating artifacts, this was one right here, this helmet, and I know it's not the best picture, but this is a soldier's helmet from around Statesboro, and he most likely painted it after the war. You don't want that bright of a helmet during the war, so on his way home he probably painted it, and it's now kind of a commemorative piece of art, and it's been hanging on the family's wall for years. And it has, you know, the AEF eagle on the front. It has the Transportation Corps emblem on the back, his years of date of enlistment, his initials, and it's just a very beautiful piece of art. And so these are things that locals, you know, people have these in their family collections, and we would love to see what they have. Another artifact that I really love is this diary and this letter right here. And this is from the Georgia Southern Museum's collection. And basically what the letter says, the soldier writes home and says that he found this rose on the battlefield, and he sent it because he wanted his family to know that despite the destruction, despite all the chaos going on, this one rose was still standing, not even the gas had touched it. Of course, then he cut it down and sent it with the letter, but people think it's pretty cool to see a rose from 1918 France in the collection, and it's really pretty. Another artifact that displays that Civil War connection is this piece of sheet music. And this piece of sheet music was for the soldiers at Camp Wheeler, Georgia. And in it, they talk about how our granddaddies fought in the Civil War, and now we are fighting for our country also. We're gonna knock the Kaiser off his throne. And it's just it's a great piece of music, and it's one of my artifacts that I've become addicted to collecting. So of course I love it. So in addition to having more training bases than any other state in the country, Georgia had the most internment camps as well. And so I'm sure most of you have heard about Japanese internment during World War II, but that system was perfected in World War I. In World War I, the federal government only had 4 internment camps. And 2 of those were in Georgia, one at Fort McPherson near Atlanta and one at Fort Oglethorpe near the Tennessee border. And there would have been 2 types of people in these camps. So you weren't going to have soldiers from the trenches being sent over to the United States to be put in these camps. You were going to have 2 types of people. Fort McPherson, it was mainly sailors. And that could be 2 types of sailors. So these could be merchant sailors who were stuck in U.S. ports when the war broke out, and so they were kept here. They weren't going to be sent back home to become part of the military. But there would also be naval sailors. And so, for example, these men walking into the camp or Fort McPherson gates are from the German submarine U-58. The British sunk the submarine, and then the crew were sent to Georgia. So Fort Oglethorpe, on the other hand, would have had mainly enemy aliens. And enemy aliens would have been basically non-naturalized citizens of enemy nations. So that could have meant Austria, Germany, the Ottoman Empire, but they were mostly German. And you weren't automatically sent to one of these camps. When the war broke out, first they faced restrictions, so they couldn't live or work within a certain distance of military bases or factories that were producing goods for the war. Then they had to eventually register. After they registered, if someone said that they were being suspicious or they were viewed as unpatriotic or against the war, then they could be arrested and sent to one of these internment camps. And this included women. So Fort Oglethorpe actually held women for a very short period of time as well. Now in these camps, prisoners were able to do a variety of things that they actually, ironically, weren't allowed to do outside of the camps. So at the time, you have German culture basically being made illegal outside of the camp. So you see German newspapers, German education programs, German language programs are all going to be ended outside of these camps. But within them, they are allowed to practice their culture. And I love this example. So this is a photo, again, of Fort McPherson. And this is a gymnastics club made up of prisoners at Fort McPherson. And what I really love about it is the whole thing, except for McPherson, Georgia, is in German. And so this basically says gymnastics club. Vater Jan was basically a famous gymnast in Germany. And then they have the German Iron Cross. And so this is in an American POW camp that they have this sign. And they were going to have a variety of sports that they played at Fort Oglethorpe. They even had a German language magazine that they had. And they would also make crafts and sell them at a canteen. One of the reasons that guards allowed them to do this was to keep them occupied. Boredom could mean issues. Boredom could mean that they tried to revolt, they tried to escape, which there were escape attempts. Some people did get away, others got caught. Others got away and they got recaptured. But they also allowed them to perform these activities in order to prevent what they called at the time barbed wire disease or depression. Despite that, soldiers did commit suicide, others died of natural causes, and in some cases, prisoners were killed by guards. And this is one of those cases. At Fort McPherson, a sailor by the name of Heinrich Knopf, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, he was playing baseball, which was totally normal, but he chased a fly ball and the guard thought he was trying to escape and shot him and killed him. It caused widespread tension in the camp, and this is actually a picture of his funeral. Now, what's really interesting about the prisoners who were buried, or who died at Fort McPherson, is that they were buried with full military honors, and they were interred in the Marietta National Cemetery. Now, what's weird about that is that this is a time when even African American and Latino soldiers could not be buried alongside white soldiers. But you have German prisoners of war being buried next to American soldiers in a national cemetery. It was not without controversy. They were actually moved less than a year later to the Westview Cemetery in Atlanta, which is where they still currently are. The prisoners who died at Fort Oglethorpe are buried now at Chattanooga National Cemetery, and there's actually a German monument to them in that cemetery. So just really interesting dynamics. So most of the American soldiers that were going over to fight in the war were going to fight exclusively on the Western Front, and that meant trench warfare. And trench warfare was not a nice thing. If you come to our exhibit, you'll be able to come into our 7-foot or more tall trench here. The kids love to climb up in it. They can climb in it, play in it, try on all these little artifacts we have for them. So I encourage you to come visit. But trench warfare was not nice, despite the amount of fun that the kids might have, or you might have, in our trench. Trench warfare was not fun. You had rats, they flooded, you have disease, you have trench foot. It's just not a nice place to be, and it causes its own set of issues. So for example, I showed you earlier that machine gun unit picture. So while you have machine guns like that, this is an ambulance. It's basically some plywood on the side of the vehicle. So while you have these huge advancements in weaponry, the medical field really just could not keep up with that. And they did make advancements. So you have the first use of x-rays for soldiers, blood drives for soldiers, but you're still dealing with this gap between weaponry and medicine at the time. And that's just a struggle that they continue to try to overcome. If you would have gone through our trench, one of the things you would have seen is a gas mask. So two of the things that soldiers feared more than anything were, one, being buried alive. So say you're sleeping in a trench and an artillery shell hits, you could be buried alive in the trench, and that was something soldiers were just terrified of. But the other thing was gas, and that was because you couldn't see it coming. You couldn't run from it, you couldn't hide from it, you never knew when it was going to strike, and they were just terrified of it. And so one of the kind of unique stories of Georgia is the collection of fruit pits and nutshells to make gas mask filters. And I always like to tell this story because actually undergraduate researchers at Georgia Southern found this information. We were unaware of this, and they, in their class, were doing newspaper research, and they came across several articles like this, where you're being asked to collect these fruit pits and nutshells, you dry them out, and you donate them to the Red Cross or the Salvation Army, and then they get sent to collection points like this, they get ground up and carbonized, and that's what's in your gas mask filter. So a really unique kind of contribution by Georgia civilians. All right, so at the beginning I said this was going to be a war that encompassed everyone, and that was going to reflect kind of bigger social issues. And one of the ways you see that is by the involvement of women in the war. And when people think of women in World War I and World War II, this is what they think of: Red Cross nurses. And a lot of that is because of all the propaganda posters that show women as Red Cross nurses. And they did perform as Red Cross nurses. That's accurate. But they did a variety of other things as well. So for one, they were going to be right there on the battlefield. They were actually some of the first and last people on the Western Front, ahead of the American Expeditionary Forces, because they were with these aid organizations. And so in this case, these women are serving donuts to US soldiers. So they're going to be right there living in the same conditions as the men. They're also going to perform a variety of jobs that they would not have been able to perform before the war. Jobs that were typically masculine jobs, and that was going to be on the battlefield, but also at home. So this is the Women's Motor Corps in Waycross, Georgia during the war, but they're also going to do things that actually now a lot of people think of as feminine jobs that before wouldn't have been. So being secretaries or librarians, surgeons, all kinds of things, women were going to be able to do these jobs. Also working on farms. Because the men were gone, women worked on farms and increased the number of women working in agriculture significantly during these years. And this is another Georgia woman. And so at the time, women were even given these civilian uniforms, and she's wearing one here for the YMCA. And that was to basically show that even though women weren't in the military, they weren't, you know, in the trenches, they were just as essential to the war effort as men were. And that's why you have these civilian uniforms. And she actually did work overseas as well. So while you have women contributing to the war effort in numerous ways, they don't have the right to vote yet. And the suffrage movement had been going on long before the war started, but when the war broke out, women were actually expected to kind of stop complaining about not having the right to vote. That was distracting from the war effort, that could be viewed as disloyal. And so you kind of do see, for the most part, women kind of put this on hold, but then they're like, hey, we contributed to the war effort, like we are equals. And eventually you do have the federal government passing legislation for women to have the right to vote. One of the things I think is important to point out, though, is that even before the federal government made it a federal law, states in the West and also small cities had, well, not small cities, but cities around the country had allowed women to vote even before that. So for example, Atlanta and Waycross had allowed women to vote in municipal elections before it was even federal law. Then once it was federal law, Georgia ended up, as a state, kind of postponing women's voting until 1922, actually. So a few years after it was federal law, they still managed to postpone it a bit further. African American soldiers also kind of face that dual challenge of contributing to the war effort, but then facing Jim Crow discrimination at home. And as I was researching African American soldiers in Georgia, I found something really odd. And that was that none of the pictures were of them fighting. None of them, even at training, were pictures of them holding machine guns or throwing grenades or holding bayonets. Anything that I found of white soldiers, I wasn't finding that with black soldiers. And this is an example. So this is a picture at Camp Gordon in Georgia, and these soldiers are reading. You'd also find them learning to salute or being baptized, but never holding weapons, never doing anything that seemed militaristic. And one of the reasons we think that that is to basically kind of ease people's fears of arming African Americans. And this was something that was actually a huge fear at the time. In fact, in newspapers, you see suggestions that conscripted African American soldiers should be used on farms instead of actually being militarily trained. That did not end up happening. There were 2 infantry units, all black infantry units. Most other African American soldiers were in support and supply divisions, but actually the first 2 American soldiers to be awarded the French Croix de Guerre, which is a French honorable award, were African American soldiers. And so they fought with distinction, but they were still facing these fears by white Georgians. So this picture took me a very long time to find, and this would have probably terrified people at the time. I found it at the National World War I Museum. It doesn't tell where the soldiers are from, but I guarantee you it would be very, very hard to find a picture like this that was presented to Georgians. So, like I said, at the same time that you have African American soldiers fighting in the military, they are facing extreme discrimination at home. This is the height of the Jim Crow era. And in 1918, Georgia was reported to have more lynchings than any other state in the country. And so this is something that they are facing here. There we go. So there were a couple of other things that happened at this time that made it even more dangerous and one of the worst kind of times in Georgia history. One was the rise of the Second KKK. And that happened around 1915. And unlike the first Ku Klux Klan, the Second KKK didn't just discriminate against African Americans, but also Catholics, Jews, and immigrants, mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe, which were coming into the country at the time. So you have the rise of the Second Klan. You also have in 1915 the movie Birth of a Nation coming out, which is kind of promoting that the Klan are heroes in the South. And this was a movie that became popular all around the country, not just in the South. Also in 1915, you have the lynching of Leo Frank. And this is going to be in Marietta, Georgia. And the lynching of Leo Frank became kind of national news, and it didn't spotlight Georgia in a very good way. Leo Frank was a Jewish American man who was accused of the rape and murder of a 13-year-old girl in Atlanta, and then he was lynched for it. It was later found he was most likely not guilty of it. But again, this was something that Georgians were trying to clear their name from when they decided to kind of get on board with the war effort. They didn't want this to be what they were remembered for. There we go. All right. Also on a horrifying note, Spanish flu. So you're going to have during the First World War, you're going to have some kind of global health issues coming about also. And the biggest one was definitely Spanish flu. So right as the war is kind of wrapping up, this global pandemic hits. And this is going to impact people on the home front, it's going to impact soldiers, and it's going to impact a variety of countries. And one of the reasons why it was able to become so deadly, so bad, and spread so quickly was actually because of the war. So you have people moving across borders, whether that's someone from Virginia coming to Georgia to train, or someone going from Georgia to France to fight. You have people moving across borders and taking the disease with them. You also have groups gathering together. So you have soldiers in the trenches. You have people in industries working in munitions factories. You have people for victory parades. So all these people gathered together, that's going to also allow this disease to spread. You also have a shortage of medical personnel because they're over helping in the war effort. And so they can't really do much about the spread of the disease. And so this was going to kill several people. Actually, the prisoner camp at Fort Oglethorpe had a breakout, and that's actually how most of the, I believe, 78 individuals who died there died during the Spanish flu outbreak, and they actually had to quarantine it for a long period of time. And this is a Statesboro soldier who, it says he died of pneumonia. That was likely as a result of Spanish flu. They would often get the flu and then get pneumonia afterwards and die from pneumonia. But he basically died as soon as he got over to Europe, he died. And these are some kind of unique artifacts for the Statesboro area. So again, these artifacts were all given on loan by, I believe 3 individuals in this family were able to kind of come together and give us this whole case worth of collections. And this gentleman whose artifacts are displayed here, his name was Dr. Edward Lane Moore. There's actually a road named after him in Statesboro. And Dr. Moore was already in Paris when the war broke out in 1914. He was in medical school there. And so when the war broke out, he decided he was going to serve with the French military and help them as a medic. In 1916, he came back to the United States and joined the US military, and then went back over to France and was a medic for them. And so he actually has medals from both countries. So this is his US Victory Medal, and then this is his French Croix de Guerre right here, and this is his Croix de Guerre certificate from the French government. These are some of his medical books and maps from when he was overseas, and some postcards that he sent home. And so just a very cool collection that, you never know what people have laying around in their houses. All right. So one of the biggest contributions that Georgia civilians made during the war was the contribution of food. So when the war broke out, Georgians were asked to basically feed the Allies, not just the American military, but the Allies also. And this wasn't something that went by without controversy either. So I'm sure if you go to Statesboro, you see cotton fields, you see the Georgia snow. farmers were asked to stop growing cotton and instead grow crops. The problem is cotton is more profitable. And so a great many of them did start growing crops instead, but others kept growing cotton, and in the newspapers, they're really bashed for it. Again, called disloyal, unpatriotic, selfish, and greedy. And so it could really kind of hurt your reputation to not grow crops instead. And there are tons and tons of these propaganda posters for the food conservation effort. And I always, I love this one because it says food is ammunition. And I just imagine throwing corn cobs or radish at someone and that's the weapon. And so even individuals who, if they weren't commercial farmers, they were asked to grow their own victory gardens. So basically grow your own food to eat for dinner instead of going to the store and wasting this food we could be sending to our troops. All right, we're getting towards the end of the war, I promise. This has an ending eventually. So by November 1918, the Germans really just could not keep up anymore, especially because the Americans had come in and reinforced the Allies, and they just didn't have any reinforcements of their own. And so they had been talking to President Woodrow Wilson because they kind of liked his 14 points. The 14 points ensured leniency towards the Germans. So on November 11th, 1918, they signed the armistice, which is basically a ceasefire. The actual Treaty of Versailles in 1919 was nothing like the 14 points, though, and it was not lenient at all towards the Germans. In fact, they had to pay an undetermined amount of reparations, which later sent them and the whole world into a depression. They had to dismantle their territory and their military. And so you can see, and they weren't the only ones. The Austro-Hungarian Empire also collapsed. The Ottoman Empire collapsed, and Russia was in a revolution. And so you see the complete kind of dismantling of all these territories in this bluish gray color. And the problem is that the victors are going to be the ones that really kind of draw these political lines. And they didn't, put that much research or thought into what any of these people wanted, or their political or economic or social or cultural situations. And so this is basically just showing that there's going to be continued conflict. This isn't a very smooth end to the war. You're still going to have tensions and issues in these areas. You also really have to rebuild Europe. And so even after the war, you continue seeing posters like this, which are asking Americans to continue contributing to rebuild Europe. They usually feature a woman, a child, and a devastated landscape and smoke in the background. And so again, this is why women were some of the last people to leave the Western Front, is because they're still going to be serving with aid organizations overseas. So as I said before, medical technology could not keep up with advancements in weaponry. And one of the biggest weaknesses or issues with trenches is that as soon as you step up, your face is the first thing that's exposed. Even when shrapnel is flying around, your face is right there. You have a helmet on, you have a uniform on, but your face is uncovered. And so there were a significant amount of facial injuries. And actually, this is one of the first times, so this is before you have the VA or the GI Bill or anything like that. This is one of the first times that the US government recognizes we have to start doing something when troops come home. So you start seeing that they're trying to have these rehabilitation programs or job training, or helping them get employed, helping them get some kind of medical help. But you also had civilians kind of taking up that weight as well. And Anna Coleman Ladd was one of them. And she wasn't a Georgian, we can't claim her, but she's an American, so we can claim her that way. But she was a sculptor, and she decided that she was going to help soldiers who plastic surgery could not help. And so what she did is she would take a cast of their face, and then she would make a mask from it, covering up the injured part of their face. And she would spend months painting it to match their skin tone and their facial expression. And so this is one of the soldiers she helped, and you can see on the left image that his eye was missing, and on the right image, she attached the mask to these glasses, and so it would cover up that area. Now, again, this doesn't restore function. It's not going to, help him see, obviously, but it's supposed to help them feel like they can fit back in without being stared at on the street, without kind of, having horrified looks. And so it's just one of those steps that shows some kind of changes had to be made. Another issue after the war was the continued racial tension in the country. And so African American troops returned home expecting and hoping that by serving they had gained equality, that it would be the end of Jim Crow and this would be a new step forward. And that really just was not the case. Especially when you have soldiers coming home and they need their jobs back. There's a lot of tension surrounding jobs. And in 1919, as these soldiers are coming back, you have riots breaking out across the country. And these are just a few here. You do see some in big cities like Chicago, and those were some of the biggest. But you also have in Georgia these small towns. You know, it's not just places like Atlanta or Savannah. It's these smaller towns, these smaller communities where issues are breaking out as well. And in many cases, these riots would follow the lynching of a black soldier. So for example, in one town in Georgia, a soldier named William Little had returned home and he wore his uniform around every day. Now it's unclear why he wore his uniform every day. It was suggested that he didn't have other clothing, but either way he was harassed by a mob of white men and then later lynched for wearing his uniform around. And this sparked riots throughout the year. Riots would break out and die down, break out again, and that's how it was in several of these towns. And so this is again just showing these issues are not solved. These are conflicts that are going to eventually lead to other things like the Second World War and the Civil Rights Movement. Even though at the time people called the First World War the war to end all wars, it really wasn't. This is not to say that African American soldiers had never or African Americans had never tried to fight for their liberties or challenged the system of discrimination before. Even during the First World War, soldiers who were stationed in Texas kind of clashed with Texas locals over Jim Crow laws that were in place there, and it led to the court-martial and execution of several of those soldiers. It became known as the Camp Logan Riots, or Camp Logan Mutiny, I'm sorry. Also, the 1906 Atlanta race riots had broken out a few years before the war also. And so it's just, this is something that was ongoing. It wasn't just kind of spur of the moment. All right, now on to the Otranto. More negativity. So just as the war is about to end, a group of soldiers are leaving on board a ship called the Otranto, and they're leaving from Tybee Island and they're going over to the Western Front. They collide with another ship. The ship sinks and kills almost all of those on board. Unfortunately, many of those, because of how the units were arranged, many of those were Georgia soldiers. The town of Nashville, Georgia actually lost more on board the Otranto than any other city in the state. And so those who died were buried because of where they sank, some in Northern Ireland and some in Scotland. And this is the funeral ceremony for some of them. They were given full military honor, parades throughout the cities, and then buried there. And again, another blurry picture, but these are some of the artifacts that we have. This one is just a newspaper article that lists more Georgians that were added to the list of those who died on board the Otranto. And this is an artifact that a local family brought forth for us. And so this is a soldier who was on board the Otranto. And he and his friend, when the Otranto, before it was completely sunk, a rescue ship pulled up next to it, and soldiers were jumping over to the rescue ship. He and his friend went to jump. His friend jumped and made it. When he went to jump, a wave hit and separated the ships, and he fell between them and then was crushed. And so his friend survived and brought the story, home to tell the family, and so we have this artifact of him. Now, Nashville, Georgia did lose several soldiers on board the Otranto, and in the end of the war, they had more soldiers die per capita than any other city in Georgia. For that reason, they really wanted some kind of monument or memorial for their fallen soldiers. And so they contacted an artist that was living at the time in Americus, Georgia, and he created this statue here, which became known as the Spirit of the American Doughboy. And this became so popular that places around the country wanted the same thing, and they ordered the same thing. And so this is really the World War I monument. When people think of World War I monuments, this is what it is. And the first one was right here in Georgia. It also got made into smaller versions you could have in your house, like the candlesticks that candlestick holders that I showed you earlier.
Where is Nashville, Georgia?
Berrien County. That's all I can tell you. I've never been there. Another kind of commemorative thing that you would see that's really unique to the First World War is trench art. And so this is one of my addictions also. These are all my artifacts. I have a problem. But if you would like to donate trench art to the Brittany is Poor Foundation, feel free. Trench art is unique to the First World War also. And so basically you have all these huge shells laying around the Western Front. And people would take them and make them into art. Some of them are from wartime. All of these pieces are post-war commemorative art. And so the piece I love the most is this big piece in the back because it's a German shell, first of all, which we know from the markings on the bottom. It's a German shell with an American Expeditionary Forces emblem on the back or front. It has someone's initials on the back. And then on the bottom is inscribed where it was found in France on the Hindenburg Line on May 23rd, 1919. So we know exactly where this shell was, but a German shell with an American Expeditionary Forces emblem that was found in France. So, and then this crucifix here made out of bullets is a kind of traditional battlefield tourist piece. So you'll see several of these. But if you go as a battlefield tourist, this is what you're likely going to see in the store. And prisoners would make these, soldiers would make these, but civilians also made these. And so it's really hard to trace down who actually made each piece, but they're cool nonetheless. And then finally, another Civil War connection. So before the First World War, the North and South did not celebrate Memorial Day together. The First World War changed that. And so it was a huge moment in reuniting the country. And so you see this Memorial Day poster, and you have the renditions of Union and Confederate soldiers carrying American flags in front of World War I soldiers carrying American flags. And it says, "In memory of American soldiers of the wars," and it lists, of course, the Civil War, and this is for the First World War. So this was going to be significant, again, and really reuniting the country, and this was something that was obviously recognized at the time. Questions?
The symbol of the poppy comes up during World War I, right?
Yes.
Has a Georgia connection?
Yes. So the poppy symbol, Moira Michaels is the woman who is kind of credited with making that a lot more famous. So the poppies that you would see on battlefields, it was used in a poem, but then because it was kind of recognized as a World War I symbol, Moira Michael started selling little poppies to raise money for veterans. And so that's how it really became kind of like this big popularized recognition.
And she's a Georgian?
Yes, yes. And she taught at, I believe she taught at UGA. I have to double check on that. I think she, at the time when she started selling them, I think she might have lived in New York though. I can't remember. Any other questions? Yeah.
Now, Savannah has a World War I monument. It's located at Daphne Park. However, I think all the other wars, they have monuments downtown. We've got American Revolution, Civil War, and even the Mexican-American War and the Spanish-American War, and World War II. But we put the World War I monument up there in Daphne Park. Yeah, go ahead.
So it's the World War I monument stone is out there because we have the World War I Memorial Boulevard of Victory Drive, which dates to 1922. And that's 19 miles long, and a lot of people aren't aware of it. And so I think you raise a good point that we need to raise awareness that we have this Memorial Boulevard and the granite monument that goes along with it, which used to be in the intersection of Victory Drive and Waters Avenue. So the Memorial Boulevard and the granite monument, which the monument was dedicated in 1929, and lists an honor roll of over 120 Tuncanians. So, at least 10 or 11 which died on the Otranto maritime disaster. So I actually wanted to mention it because people do need to be more aware of that monument and the boulevard as well.
Aren't the palm trees represented each person along Victory Drive?
They are not. They don't represent specific people, and in fact, a lot of the palm trees, particularly through Chatham Crescent development, they started being planted before World War I as part of the neighborhood's development in the early 19 teens. And then city engineer Rockwell in 1919 made the proposal that Estill Avenue be renamed Victory Drive, and he proposed the landscaping based on the existing palm trees. So additional palm trees were planted, and there's way more palm trees than the actual number of individuals that we lost.
What is your understanding of the term Doughboy? Where does that come from? I understand it goes back to Pancho Villa days. I know there are many definitions.
Yeah, there is a lot of debate on it, and honestly, I'm not really sure. We talked about that in class a lot, like where did that term actually come from, and I don't even know if historians are 100% sure or can agree on where the term Doughboy came from.
I heard that it came from the Mexican War when all the dirt got on their uniforms and they actually looked like doughboys.
I've heard different rumors, but yeah, you probably know just as much as I do about that one. Anyone else? Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank Brittany. I think that was a really great sort of overview of Georgian's contributions, and I want to encourage you guys to go see the exhibit in person. I went to see it. There's way more than she was able to tell us about, and seeing the items in person. And the Georgia Southern's exhibit is what inspired us to do an exhibit here and reach out to the community to see what would turn up. And our exhibit very much will depend on what comes out of the woodwork and where we go with that. So I want to thank Brittany for coming down, and we just have a little thank you present. There is the free admission pass that they're sharing with us, as well as the call out for our own exhibit and the information about our lecture next month about more in depth about the internment camps in Georgia. And then if any of you would like to go across the hall to see the Small Treasures exhibit, which has that USS Savannah item, which I'm not telling you what it is, because if you want to know, you have to come see it. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brittany.
And feel free to take multiple postcards if you want to give them to other people. We have plenty.